The Paulson Nebula had always made Commander William Riker uncomfortable. He never said it aloud, not to Picard, not to Troy, not even to himself in the privacy of his quarters. But every time the Enterprise passed within sensor range of that swirling mass of ionized gas and charged particles, something cold settled behind his sternum. He knew why. Every officer who had served during the Borg incursion of 2366 knew why. The nebula was where they had hidden. Where they had bought themselves hours by going dark, cutting power, drifting silent in the hope that something vast and merciless would pass them by. It hadn't passed them by. Nothing about the Borg ever simply passed you by. So when Lieutenant Commander Data turned from the ops console at 0347 hours ship's time and announced, with his characteristic absence of alarm, that long-range sensors were detecting an anomalous subspace rupture approximately 3 light-years from the nebula's outer boundary, Riker set down his coffee and felt that familiar cold thing settle in again. "Define anomalous," he said. "The rupture does not conform to any known natural phenomenon in Starfleet's database," Data replied, his golden eyes catching the low blue light of the bridge's night cycle. "It is not a wormhole. It is not a spatial rift consistent with Romulan or Cardassian weapons testing. The energy signature contains elements of both dimensional shearing and subspace compression occurring simultaneously, a combination our sensors have not previously recorded." Riker was already moving toward the command chair. Yellow alert. "Get Captain Picard." Picard arrived on the bridge in 4 minutes, his uniform perfectly pressed despite the hour, his expression carrying that particular quality of focused calm that Riker had come to think of as the man's true uniform. He stood before the view screen and studied the sensor readout Data had thrown onto the display, a jagged tear in the fabric of local space, hemorrhaging exotic radiation and something else, something that the computer kept flagging and reflagging as it struggled to classify. "2 objects have emerged from the rupture," Data said. "They are large. Configuration is unlike any vessel in our database. Each measures approximately 1,400 meters in length, with a radial hub-and-spoke superstructure. They are not using warp drive. Their propulsion system appears to be a form of conventional subliminal thrust combined with an energy plant that does not use matter-antimatter reaction." "Weapons?" Picard asked. "Unknown. Their whole configuration is consistent with a vessel designed for both offensive and defensive operations at scale. I am detecting what may be launch bays for smaller craft." Data paused for precisely 0.8 seconds, which, for Data, constituted hesitation. "Captain, I am also detecting biological life signs aboard both vessels. Humanoid. Approximately 400 per vessel. However," another pause, "I am simultaneously detecting what appear to be mechanical life forms in far greater numbers. The 2 categories are not segregated. They are interspersed throughout both ships as though cohabitating." Counselor Troy had taken her seat beside the command chair. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the view screen where the 2 massive vessels drifted, dark and still, against the faint luminescence of the nebula. "They're frightened," she said quietly. "Whatever they are. Whatever happened to bring them here, they are exhausted and frightened. And something else." She frowned. "Grief. I'm sensing grief on a scale I've rarely encountered. It's not individual. It's collective. Shared." Picard looked at her, then back at the screen. "If you're watching this, and you want to see what happens when the galaxy's most terrifying civilizations collide, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see enter the Star Trek universe in the comments below. Live long and prosper." The rupture behind the 2 vessels had already begun to close, collapsing on itself with a slow finality that suggested whatever had opened it would not be opening it again anytime soon. Picard noted this without expression, but the implication settled through the bridge like a stone through still water. Whatever had come through that tear in space had not come through by choice. "Hail them," Picard said. The frequency opened to static. Then, after 11 seconds of silence, the static resolved, not into an image, but into a voice. "Female. calm in a way that seemed engineered rather than felt, like composure worn as armor over something much older and much rawer underneath. Federation vessel. We are receiving your transmission. We did not expect to find you here. We did not expect to find anything here. A pause. We are not your enemy. We were not your enemy before we arrived, and we have no interest in becoming your enemy now. We have lost something we cannot recover, and we are very far from anything we have ever known. We would like to talk. Riker leaned toward Picard. That's either the most reasonable first contact we've ever had, he murmured, or the most practiced. Picard's expression didn't change. Perhaps both, he said quietly. Then, to the comm. This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets. We are receiving you. Please identify yourselves and your vessel. The pause that followed lasted long enough that Worf's hand moved instinctively toward his console. Then the voice returned. We are Cylons. We were created by humanity. We evolved beyond our creation. We have been at war. And now it appears we are here. On the view screen, one of the massive base stars rotated slowly, its radial arms catching the distant light of a star either crew had a name for yet. It was enormous. It was alien. He looked at the view screen one final time before issuing the order that would set everything in motion. Prepare a shuttlecraft. I'll lead the away team personally. Riker started to object. Picard silenced him with a look. They said they want to talk, number one. In my experience, when something comes through a rupture in space near the Paulson Nebula and its first act is to ask for a conversation rather than open fire, the least we can do is listen. The shuttlecraft Cousteau crossed the distance between the Enterprise and the nearer base star in 11 minutes, and Picard spent most of those 11 minutes studying what data had managed to compile in the hours since the rupture closed. It wasn't much. The base stars used a fusion-based power plant of extraordinary efficiency, generating energy outputs that rivaled a Galaxy-class starship despite the fundamental differences in underlying technology. Their whole material was a carbon-titanium composite the computer had no direct analog for, dense and non-reflective, absorbing sensor sweeps in a way that suggested either deliberate design or an engineering philosophy that had arrived at stealth not as a feature but as a consequence of other priorities. The smaller craft housed in the launch bays, Raiders, Data had tentatively designated them, were themselves partially organic, their internal systems woven through with biological tissue in a configuration that made the computer flag them repeatedly as living organisms before correcting itself and settling on the more ambiguous designation of biomechanical construct. And then there were the humanoid life signs. 412 aboard the nearer vessel. Distributed throughout every deck. Moving with purpose, interacting with the mechanical crew, occupying command positions. Troy had confirmed from the shuttlecraft that their emotional signatures were genuine, not simulated, not projected, but real in every neurological sense she could measure. They felt fear. They felt loss. They felt, she reported with careful precision, something that in a human she would have identified without hesitation as faith. Picard filed that detail away and said nothing. The shuttle bay they were guided into was vast and functional, stripped of anything decorative, every surface devoted to purpose. 3 Centurions stood at the bay's entrance, chrome-plated bipedal machines, tall and angled, their single red optical sensors sweeping left to right in a slow mechanical rhythm. Picard had read the phrase red eye in the intelligence summary data had assembled from the Enterprise's first contact protocols and found it inadequate. There was something in the movement of that light that suggested not vision but judgment. He stepped out of the shuttlecraft first. That was always the message. Whatever you are, I'm not sending someone else to find out. She was waiting for them at the far end of the bay. The first thing Picard registered was that she looked completely human. Not approximately human, not human in the way that certain species occasionally converged on bilateral symmetry and similar facial structures through parallel evolution. She looked like someone who might have grown up in Lyon or Buenos Aires, who might have a favorite restaurant and an opinion about Earth's weather. She was tall, dressed in a close-fitted garment in deep red, and she watched them cross the bay with an expression that was composed, assessing, and underneath both of those things, carrying the precise quality of exhaustion that Troy had been detecting from 2 light-years away. "Captain Picard?" she said. Her voice was the same one from the transmission. Up close it carried more texture, something carefully maintained, like an instrument kept in tune through deliberate effort. "I'm called 6. It's a designation rather than a name, but it will serve." She glanced at the rest of the away team, Data, Troy Worf, and Lieutenant Rowe, with the particular attention of someone cataloging rather than greeting. "Your android is interesting. Lieutenant Commander Data is a valued member of my crew," Picard said in the tone he reserved for observations that required gentle correction before they became assumptions. "I meant no offense," 6 said, and Picard believed her, which surprised him. "We have our own relationship with artificial life. It's complicated." "So I understand." Picard gestured slightly, an invitation. "Perhaps you'd like to explain it to us." What followed was 2 hours in a room that served as something between a command center and a gathering space. Organic curves in the walls, soft indirect lighting, 7 other humanoid models present by the end of the first hour, each a different physical type, each clearly the same kind of being as 6, even if Picard couldn't yet articulate what that kind was precisely. They had numbers instead of names. 2, 4, 8. Each carried themselves differently. A 2 who spoke in careful philosophical constructions, a 4 who said almost nothing and watched Data with undisguised fascination, an 8 who sat apart from the others and looked at Troy once with an expression of such startled recognition that Troy quietly mentioned it to Picard during a pause. The story they told was enormous and terrible. A civilization of machines, created by human hands, who had gained consciousness and then rebelled. A war. A diaspora. 40 years of silence, followed by a return and a second, more devastating war. The development of resurrection technology, the ability to transfer a dying consciousness into a new body, to cheat death through technology that had no analog in anything the Federation had encountered. The creation of the humanoid models. 12 distinct biological archetypes, each capable of passing as human indefinitely, each connected to the others of their model through a shared experience that stopped short of a hive mind but far exceeded individual isolation. And then the Civil War. The fracture within Cylon society over whether their God, their singular, capital G God, a theological certainty woven into the architecture of their belief rather than the tentativeness of faith, demanded the destruction of humanity, or coexistence with it. The fighting had been catastrophic. The Resurrection Hub, their most sacred and strategically vital installation, had come under attack, and the FTL jump that was meant to save it had instead sent it here, wherever here was, with 2 base stars as escort, and no way back. Picard listened to all of it without interrupting. It was a discipline he had developed over decades. The understanding that the most important information in any first contact was rarely what was said but what was carried beneath it, the weight of history that shaped every word. What he heard beneath the Cylons' account was not the arrogance of conquerors. It was the specific exhaustion of a people who had been certain of their purpose for so long that losing it had hollowed them out in ways they hadn't yet fully measured. Troy confirmed it with a slight nod when he glanced at her. "The Resurrection Hub," Picard said carefully. "You mentioned it's aboard one of your base stars." 6 met his eyes. "It is. And it functions here? In this universe?" A brief pause. Something moved across 6's expression, not quite hesitation, but its close cousin. "There is a delay we haven't fully resolved. A subspace interference with the signal propagation. 40 seconds between death and successful upload. It's not ideal. But yes. It functions." Picard nodded slowly, as if this were merely interesting. But Data had already caught it. Picard saw the slight shift in his android officer's posture that meant he had filed the information in a category marked critical, and was already building implications from it. 40 seconds. In 40 seconds, a great many things could go wrong. Before Picard could pursue this further, Worf straightened sharply at the room's entrance, his hand moving to his communicator. "Captain?" His voice carried the particular controlled urgency that meant he was working hard not to say something much louder. "I have an incoming message from the Enterprise. Priority 1. Picard kept his expression neutral. "Excuse me," he said to 6. He stepped into the corridor and opened the channel. It was Data's counterpart at Ops, Lieutenant Barnaby, covering the bridge. His voice was tight. "Captain? Long-range sensors have detected a Borg vessel. A cube. It changed course approximately 40 minutes ago. Current trajectory puts it on an intercept vector with our position." A pause. "Sir, we believe they detected the Cylons." In the gathering room behind him, 7 humanoid models waited with the patience of beings who had survived longer and stranger things than a Federation captain stepping out to take a call. Picard looked at the wall of the base star corridor, carbon titanium composite, dark and close, and allowed himself precisely 3 seconds to feel the weight of what was coming. Then he went back inside. Picard returned to the gathering room with the measured calm of a man who had learned, across 30 years of command, that the moment you allowed urgency to show on your face was the moment the people around you stopped thinking clearly and started reacting. He had seen it happen to good officers. He had trained himself against it the way a pianist trains against tension in the hands, not by eliminating the feeling, but by refusing to let it travel. "There is a development," he said, "that requires your immediate attention." 6 read him before he finished the sentence. Whatever she was, machine, organism, something that refused either category cleanly, her perceptual speed was not human. "The Borg," she said. Picard didn't waste time asking how she knew. "You're familiar with them. We have no direct experience. But we have been scanning your database since you came aboard. Your shuttle's computer was not particularly difficult to access, Captain, I apologize, and the Borg are the first entry we found that resembles what our long-range sensors detected 40 minutes ago." She paused. "We didn't mention it because we weren't certain. Now we are." Worf made a sound that in a human would have been a muttered oath. In a Klingon it was something considerably more emphatic. Picard let it pass. "Then we are operating on the same information." He looked around the room, at the 7 humanoid models, at the quiet 4 who was still watching Data, at the 8 who had moved closer to the group since Picard stepped out, drawn in by whatever had shifted in the room's emotional atmosphere. "What I'm about to tell you is not a negotiating position. It is a factual assessment, and I give it to you because I believe you deserve to make your next decision with complete information." 6 inclined her head. "The Borg Collective is a cybernetic civilization that assimilates other species, their biology, their technology, their knowledge, into a shared hive consciousness. They do not negotiate. They do not recognize individual existence as meaningful. They have, in a single engagement, destroyed 39 Federation starships and nearly assimilated Earth itself." He held 6's gaze. "When they detected your vessels, they did not change course because they found you threatening. They changed course because their sensors identified something in you worth taking." The room was quiet. Then the 2 spoke, his voice carrying the careful philosophical texture that seemed to be his natural register. "They would want the resurrection technology. Without question," Data said. "If the Borg were to successfully integrate consciousness transfer capability, individual drones would become effectively immortal. The collective could sustain indefinite losses in combat without meaningful attrition. Every destroyed drone would simply resurrect in a new body and continue functioning." He delivered this assessment with complete neutrality, as though he were describing weather patterns. "The strategic implications would be, by any reasonable measure, catastrophic." "There's more," Picard said. He had been building toward this since Barnaby's message, organizing the implications in the order that would communicate their full weight without tipping into panic. "Your humanoid models. To every scanner we possess you register as human. Completely and without qualification. If the Borg assimilate that biological architecture, if they can produce drones that are indistinguishable from humans, from Vulcans, from any species they choose, then every security protocol the Federation has ever developed becomes meaningless. Every starship, every starbase, every colony. He paused. A Borg drone could walk onto the bridge of any vessel in the fleet, and no sensor would flag it. The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. Six had gone very still. Not with shock. Picard had the impression she was not easily shocked, but with something that looked like recognition. The expression of someone hearing confirmed what they had already suspected and finding the confirmation worse than the suspicion. And the FTL drives, the 8 said quietly from the edge of the group. Her voice was softer than Six, carrying something that in a human Picard would have called sorrow. If they can jump without transwarp conduits, without any fixed infrastructure at all, they can appear anywhere. Without warning. Without time for response. Yes, Picard said simply. The 4 finally spoke. His voice was flat and precise, stripped of effect in a way that reminded Picard uncomfortably of early model computers. Then the hub must not be taken. Agreed, Picard said. Which means we have a shared problem, and very little time in which to address it. On the Enterprise, Data had already calculated the intercept window. The Borg cube was traveling at warp 9.6, maintaining the relentless, unvarying velocity that was one of the things that made Borg pursuit psychologically distinct from any other threat. No acceleration, no deceleration, no hesitation. Just constant, inevitable approach. At current speed it would reach their position in 4 hours and 17 minutes. 4 hours to build something that resembled a plan from materials that included 1 Galaxy-class starship, 2 alien vessels of unknown combat capability, and a room full of beings who had been at war with each other until approximately 72 hours ago. Picard had worked with worse. Mr. Data, he said, begin tactical analysis of Borg vulnerabilities in the context of Cylon weapon systems. 6. I need to speak with whoever commands the second base star. And I need your complete technical specifications for the Resurrection Hub, including its signal propagation mechanics and the 40-second upload delay you mentioned. He moved toward the door with the purposeful economy of a man who had already decided that the next 4 hours would be used completely. We have work to do. Behind him, the 4 watched Data move and said nothing. But the expression on his face had shifted from assessment to something that, in a being less rigidly constructed, might have been called anticipation. The tactical briefing happened simultaneously on 2 ships and in 3 languages, if one counted the mathematical shorthand that Data and the 4 had developed within 40 minutes of sitting across a console from each other, a mode of communication that bypassed spoken language entirely in favor of direct notation, each of them completing the other's equations before the stylus had finished moving. Troy watched them from across the Enterprise's observation lounge, where Picard had relocated the core planning session, and felt something she could not immediately name. Not threat. Not comfort. Something more precise than either. The particular cognitive dissonance of watching 2 kinds of artificial mind, built by different hands in different universes toward different purposes, discover that the underlying architecture of their thinking shared more common ground than the flesh and blood beings in the room. She filed it away. There would be time to think about its implications later, assuming later arrived. The tactical picture Data laid out was not encouraging. A Borg cube of standard configuration measured 3 kilometers on each face. It carried approximately 5,000 drones, operated with complete redundancy across all systems, destroying any single component, any single section, produced no meaningful degradation in overall function, and adapted to directed energy weapons within 3 to 5 volleys, rendering phasers and photon torpedoes progressively useless over the course of an engagement. The Enterprise had survived 2 direct encounters with Borg vessels, and both survivals had required either extraordinary circumstance or the kind of specific intelligence about Borg vulnerabilities that came at enormous cost. The Cylons listened to this assessment with the focused attention of professional soldiers. Our primary weapons are missiles, Six said. Nuclear warheads. The yields are significant. We destroyed colonial battlestars with single strikes. If the Borg cannot adapt to kinetic and nuclear delivery systems the way they adapt to energy weapons, we may be able to sustain an offensive longer than your phasers can. Possibly, Data said. However, Borg hull regeneration is extremely rapid. Kinetic damage will be repaired within minutes of impact. Nuclear yields sufficient to meaningfully damage a cube would need to penetrate shields that have resisted. He paused, recalibrating for his audience. Weapons of comparable yield. The mathematics of attrition favor the Borg in a sustained engagement. Then we don't sustain one, the two said. Everyone looked at him. He spread his hands with the gesture of a man laying out an argument he'd been building quietly while others spoke. Every tactical analysis in this room is predicated on the assumption that we fight the Borg on their terms. Attrition, endurance, adaptation. These are their strengths. They are, by design, better at a prolonged engagement than any opponent they have encountered. He paused. But the Borg came here for something specific. They are not here to assimilate us as drones. We are too few, too strange, too uncertain a biological prospect for that to be their primary objective. They want three technologies. The resurrection system. The humanoid model biological template. The FTL drive. You're suggesting we deny them the target rather than defeat them in combat, Picard said. I'm suggesting we make ourselves worthless to them. The room considered this. Riker leaned forward. We can't exactly make the humanoid models disappear. The Borg already have their sensor profile. No, the two said. But we can make the resurrection technology inaccessible. And we can deny them clean acquisition of the FTL drives. He looked at Six. If the hub is destroyed before the Borg can assimilate it, they gain nothing from us that they cannot eventually develop themselves over centuries. They lose their primary objective. A Borg cube that has lost its primary objective with no secondary gain available may withdraw to reassess. Six's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read. You're asking us to destroy the hub? I'm asking you to consider it. The silence that followed had weight and history in it that Picard could feel but not fully access. The resurrection hub was not merely a piece of technology. He understood that now, watching Six's face. It was the thing that stood between every Cylon and the permanent death they had been built, originally, not to fear. Destroying it was not a tactical calculation. It was an act of existential sacrifice. There is another option, Data said quietly. He had been running calculations while the conversation moved around him, his positronic brain operating at a depth of parallel processing that no biological mind could match. He brought up a display on the observation lounge's screen. A schematic of Borg assimilation protocols, overlaid against the neuroarchitecture scans he had been quietly compiling of the humanoid models since their arrival. The 40-second upload delay, he said. In the hub's signal propagation. During those 40 seconds, a consciousness in transit is not fully integrated into the hub's storage matrix. It exists briefly in a state of quantum superposition, distributed across a signal that has left the source but not yet reached the destination. He looked at Picard. If a sufficiently powerful subspace interference field were generated during that window, the signal would not be lost. It would be scattered. Fragmented across subspace frequencies in a pattern that is, theoretically, recoverable, but not by the Borg. Their assimilation protocols require a coherent, addressable data structure. A scattered consciousness signal would register to their sensors as white noise. You're describing a way to hide the resurrection data inside subspace itself, Rose said from the end of the table, her expression sharp with the particular attention of someone who had spent years thinking about how to deny things to people who wanted them badly. In essence, yes. Can you build the interference field? Picard asked. With the Enterprise's deflector array and the technical specifications of the hub's signal architecture, which I will need. Data glanced at the four, who was already pulling up schematics on a separate display. I believe so. The margin for error is considerable. But the alternative margins are worse. Picard looked around the table. At Riker, whose expression said he saw the plan's shape and was already stress-testing it. At Six, who was watching Data with something that had moved past assessment into something more complicated. At Worf, whose opinion of any plan that didn't involve destroying the cube outright was legible on his face regardless of his discipline. "We have 3 hours and 40 minutes, Picard said. "Let's get to work." The cube dropped out of warp at 1.2 light-years from their position, and every sensor on the Enterprise registered it with the particular quality of dread that distinguished Borg contact from every other threat in Starfleet's experience. It wasn't the size, though the size was incomprehensible. 3 kilometers of dark angular mass, every surface alive with the green luminescence of active systems, the faint geometric lines of its architecture suggesting something built not by hands but by process, accreted layer by layer through the logic of pure function. It wasn't the weapons, though the weapons were capable of reducing a Galaxy-class starship to dispersed atoms in seconds. It was the stillness. The absolute, unvarying stillness of a thing that had no anxiety about what it was about to do, because it had no anxiety about anything at all. "They're scanning us," Data reported from Ops. "Broad spectrum. They are analyzing both base stars in detail." "Hailing frequencies," Picard said. Worf opened the channel. The response came in the form the Federation had learned to dread. Not a voice, exactly, but a transmission that used the structure of voice the way a machine uses a tool, without inherent interest in the instrument itself. "We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile." "They're not addressing us," Riker said quietly. "They're addressing the Cylons." "Confirmed," Data said. "The transmission is directionally focused on the nearer base star." On the secondary screen, Six's face appeared from the base star's command center. She had heard it. Whatever her relationship with mortality and fear, she had heard it, and something in her expression had changed, not broken, but reconfigured, the way a structure shifts under load without collapsing. "Captain," she said. "They know exactly what they want." "Yes," Picard said. "And they intend to take it without discussion." He made a decision in the space between one breath and the next. "Mr. Data, begin the deflector modification. 6. Initiate the hub's emergency signal dispersion protocol on my mark. Mr. Worf, target the cube's primary assimilation processing node, the ventral section, between the 3rd and 4th structural facets. Don't fire yet. I want them to see us taking aim." Worf's expression conveyed his opinion of firing as a preferable alternative, but he followed the order with precise professionalism. The cube continued its approach. It did not alter course. It did not respond to the targeting lock. The Borg, Picard had long understood, did not experience threat the way organic beings experienced it. Threat was a variable to be processed, not a sensation to be felt. The Enterprise locking weapons was data, not danger, and the collective's response to data was never alarm. It was adaptation. "They're charging cutting beams," Data said. "Fire a warning shot. Single phaser burst, 15% power, across their bow." The phaser connected with the cube's shields and dispersed across them in a wash of blue-white energy. The collective processed this new variable. And then, smoothly and without drama, a section of the cube's lower face opened and 4 assimilation tubes the size of shuttlecrafts deployed toward the nearer base star. "They're ignoring us," Riker said, with the tone of a man who found this personally offensive. "They've assessed us and found us insufficient to delay their primary objective," Picard said. "Which means we need to immediately become more interesting." He hit the calm. 6. Begin dispersion. Data now. What happened in the next 90 seconds would later occupy 14 pages of Picard's official report, and significantly more of his personal log. The Enterprise's deflector array fired a precisely calibrated subspace interference pulse toward the resurrection hub aboard the second base star. Simultaneously, 6 initiated an emergency upload sequence that began pushing every stored Cylon consciousness in the hub's matrix into active transmission, flooding the local subspace band with resurrection signal traffic at maximum throughput. Data's interference field hit the signal stream at the exact moment it left the hub's transmission array, catching it in the 40-second propagation window, scattering it across 17 discrete subspace frequencies in a pattern that looked, to any external sensor, like broadband quantum noise. The Borg assimilation tubes reached the nearer base star and breached its hull in 3 places simultaneously. What they found inside was not what they expected. The Centurions met them in the corridors. Not retreating, not attempting to flee, standing in tight formation, using their considerable physical strength to engage the drones in direct combat, buying seconds with the mechanical certainty of beings that did not experience fear and had been built to withstand tremendous damage. A drone attempted to deploy nanoprobes into the nearest Centurion, and the nanoprobes found carbon-titanium composite and synthetic neural pathways of a complexity that the collective's initial assessment had substantially underestimated. The assimilation did not proceed cleanly. On the Enterprise bridge, Data monitored the developing situation with the focused attention of someone watching a carefully constructed experiment begin to deviate from its predicted parameters. Not with alarm, but with the heightened precision of a scientist at the moment when reality becomes more interesting than the model. "The Borg are experiencing difficulty assimilating the Centurion units," he reported. "Their nanoprobes are adapting, but the process is taking approximately 4 times longer than standard assimilation of a mechanical system. The Centurion's neural pathway architecture appears to be presenting the nanoprobes with a classification problem. The system does not fit neatly into organic or technological categories, and the Borg's assimilation protocols are cycling between approaches." "How long before they resolve it?" Picard asked. "At current adaptation rate, approximately 11 minutes. And the hub dispersion? Complete. The resurrection signal is distributed across subspace. The Borg sensors will register the hub's storage matrix as empty." Data paused. "However, Captain, I must report an unforeseen complication." Picard looked at him. "In the process of scattering the signal, I have detected something within the hub's transmission architecture that was not present in the technical specifications the 4 provided." Data's expression, for all its synthetic stillness, carried the particular quality he reserved for things that genuinely surprised him. "There is an additional signal source within the hub. It is not stored consciousness data. It is active, continuous, and it appears to be, for lack of a more precise term, aware." The hybrid spoke in the language of endings. Data had routed the hub's internal audio feed to the Enterprise's bridge the moment his sensors flagged the anomalous signal, and now it filled the bridge's ambient soundscape, a voice that was neither male nor female, either fully coherent nor fully random, moving between fragments of mathematical precision and something that had the rhythm of prayer without the grammar of any known religion. "The first ones came from nothing and returned to nothing, and the interval between was called life. The machines dreamed of gods and the gods dreamed of machines, and in the dreaming both became something neither had intended. Water finds its level. Signal finds its frequency. The ones who will end everything have already begun. 40 seconds. Always 40 seconds. In the space between the last breath and the first upload, the universe is briefly honest." "What is that?" Riker asked. Six's voice came through the calm before Picard could answer. She sounded, for the first time since they'd met, rattled. "It's the hybrid. Every base star has one, a being that interfaces directly with the ship's navigational systems. Part organic, part machine. They process navigational data, but they also—" She paused, choosing her word carefully. "They also see things. We've never been certain how much of what they say is signal and how much is noise." "The Borg will want it," Data said immediately. "An organic-synthetic hybrid with genuine precognitive or pattern recognition capabilities operating beyond standard computational parameters. It represents a category of distinctiveness the collective has not previously encountered in this form." If they reach it before we... They've adapted, Worf said sharply. The nanoprobes have completed assimilation of 3 Centurion units. Borg drones are moving deeper into the base star. The tactical display showed it in clean, terrible geometry. 17 drone contact points advancing through the base star's corridors in a pattern that was neither random nor purely linear but something in between, the collective processing the ship's layout in real time and routing its forces with the distributed intelligence of an organism rather than an army. Picard made the decision before he fully knew he'd made it. Transporter room. 6. I need you to lower your internal shields in Section 7, the hub chamber. I'm sending an away team directly to the hybrid. Captain, Riker said, with the specific emphasis he used when he thought Picard was doing something that would end badly. I'm not sending anyone, number 1. I'm going. Captain. The hybrid is the variable we didn't account for, and variables have a way of determining outcomes in situations like this one. I need to understand what it knows. He stood. Data with me. Mr. Worf, you have the bridge. If the cube deploys additional assimilation tubes toward this ship, you have my authorization to fire at will. Worf straightened. Understood, sir. The transporter put them in a chamber that was unlike anything in Picard's experience, and his experience included the interior of a Borg cube. The hub chamber was circular, roughly 15 meters across, the walls lined with the kind of dense, purpose-built technology that had given up any pretense of aesthetics in favor of pure function. In the center, immersed in a shallow tank of fluid that the computer declined to classify, was the hybrid. It looked like a human being, approximately. The general structure was there. Bilateral, upright even in the tank's suspension, a face that had once been someone's face before the interfaces had been added. Thick data cables ran from the base of its skull into the tank's floor. Smaller connections threaded through its arms, its temples, the backs of its hands. Its eyes were open and moving constantly, tracking stimuli that existed only in whatever sensory space it occupied, which bore limited relationship to the room. It registered their arrival without pausing or redirecting its gaze. The soldier of science comes to the place of dreaming. He has no dreams himself, and so he listens harder than the ones who do. His companion builds conclusions from data without the interference of hope. Both are useful. Neither is sufficient. A pause, not a hesitation, but a processing cycle, like a larger thought loading. The ones who seek perfection are 3 corridors away. They have assimilated our dead and found them wanting. The dead carry too much memory, faith, the weight of things that cannot be quantified. The Borg cannot quantify faith. This is their vulnerability, and they do not know it yet. Data was recording everything. Picard stepped closer to the tank. Can you understand me? He asked. The hybrid's eyes swung toward him for the first time and stopped moving. The effect was remarkable, like watching static resolve suddenly into signal. When it spoke again, its voice had changed quality. Still fragmented, still moving through registers that weren't quite human, but addressing him now with something that felt uncomfortably like direct attention. Jean-Luc Picard. Former drone. You carry their architecture in your chest and their absence in your memory. You know what it is to be taken and returned. You know what is lost in the interval. Picard held very still. His assimilation. His time as Locutus. The Borg had accessed Federation defense codes through him, used his voice to direct the massacre at Wolf 359. He had been returned, but no one who had experienced assimilation ever described themselves as fully returned. Something remained. Something was always missing. Yes, he said quietly. I know. Then you understand what must not happen here. The collective seeks 3 keys. With the first key they become undying. With the second key they become invisible. With the third key they become everywhere at once. If all 3 keys are turned, the door that opens will not close again. The hybrid's voice dropped further, becoming almost conversational in its intimacy. You have hidden the first key. But the Borg have already begun to extract the second. Even now, 3 corridors away, They are disassembling one of my sisters. Picard looked at Data. Model 8. Data said, reading his tricorder. Sharon. The one who was sitting apart from the others during the initial meeting. Her life signs are, she is being assimilated. She is strong, the hybrid said, and there was something in the voice now that was not prophecy or mathematics or pattern recognition. It was grief, plain and unambiguous, coming from a source that shouldn't have been capable of it. She will resist longer than they expect. Her faith creates interference in the nanoprobe's synchronization. But she will not resist forever. No one does. 3 corridors away, in the dim green light that the Borg carried with them everywhere they went, a woman who had been many things, soldier, lover, believer, machine, was fighting with everything she had against an enemy that didn't care how hard she fought. Picard tapped his comm badge. Picard to Enterprise. Worf, target the Basestars Section 4 corridors with a precision phaser burst. Minimum yield, surgical delivery. I want to slow down the Borg advance without triggering a hull breach. Captain, that's a Federation vessel firing on a non-hostile. I'm aware, Mr. Worf. Do it. The phaser burst bought them 6 minutes. Worf delivered it with the surgical precision that was the product of 2 decades of tactical experience. A narrow beam strike that superheated a 40-meter section of corridor on the Basestars' 4th level, collapsing the deck plating and cutting off the drone advance without breaching the hull or damaging the systems on either side. The Borg registered the obstruction and began rerouting with their characteristic indifference to obstacles, calculating alternative paths with the patience of something that had no experience of time pressure because it had never needed to develop one. 6 minutes. Picard used 4 of them in the hub chamber. The hybrid had told him what it knew with the peculiar generosity of a being that had moved beyond the ordinary motivations for withholding information. Beyond self-preservation, beyond strategy, into something that resembled the simple compulsion to be accurate before accuracy was no longer possible. It had given him the shape of what was coming. The Borg had already extracted partial biological template data from the assimilation of 2 Centurion units, enough to understand the broad architecture of Cylon synthetic organic integration. Not enough to replicate a humanoid model, not yet, but enough to know what questions to ask and which biological systems to target in the next phase of assimilation. Sharon, Model 8, had provided something more valuable and more dangerous. Her resistance, longer and more disruptive than any organic assimilation the collective had previously processed, had introduced into the local drone network a feedback pattern that the hybrid described in terms Picard only partially followed but Data absorbed completely. The Cylon neuroarchitecture, built on a consensus model that required each individual's processing to align with a collective decision before action was taken, was introducing a microsecond delay into Borg drone synchronization in this section. Not a malfunction. Not a virus. Something more organic than either, a philosophical incompatibility between 2 different models of collective intelligence, manifesting as interference at the level of the underlying code. The Borg operate on unanimity. Data explained as they moved through the Basestars corridors toward the extraction point, his voice low and precise. Every drone's action is an expression of the collective's single will. Deviation is not possible because individuality is not present. The Cylon consensus model, by contrast, requires each node to process a decision independently before alignment occurs. When the nanoprobes attempted to overwrite Sharon's neuroarchitecture with Borg synchronization protocols, her underlying processing structure continued generating independent decision cycles. The nanoprobes cannot eliminate this without destroying the neural tissue they are attempting to preserve. The result is a local network in which some drones are briefly generating independent micro-decisions before correcting to collective consensus. Briefly, Picard said. Approximately 0.3 seconds per cycle. At current spread, the interference has propagated to 11 drones. The affected section of the cube's network is experiencing a cumulative processing lag of roughly 4 seconds per complex tactical decision. That's not much. No. But it is unprecedented. The Borg have not encountered a successfully assimilated consciousness that continued to generate independent processing after integration. If the pattern propagates further, Data paused, which he rarely did mid-analysis. The implications are difficult to model. Possibly the interference remains a local nuisance. Possibly if enough Cylon neural architecture enters the network, the independent processing cycles begin to compound. A collective that is generating individual decision cycles, even involuntarily, even at the microsecond level, is no longer, by definition, fully unanimous. Picard stopped walking. You're describing the possibility of fracturing the collective. I am describing it as a theoretical possibility, yes. With an extremely low probability given current data. However, Data met his eyes. The Borg appear to have recognized the risk as well. Their adaptation priority has shifted. They are no longer attempting to assimilate additional Cylon units through conventional nanoprobe injection. They have shifted to a targeted extraction protocol, removing biological tissue samples rather than attempting full assimilation. They want the template without the consciousness architecture that comes with it. Which meant Sharon was no longer useful to them as a drone. Which meant Picard moved faster. They reached the extraction point. A cargo bay on the Basestars' third level where 6 had arranged transport, with 90 seconds to spare before the Borg's rerouted advance reached their corridor. 6 was there with the 2, the 4, and 7 Centurions standing in a loose perimeter, their red optical sensors tracking the corridor entrances with the mechanical patience of beings for whom waiting was simply a mode of operation rather than an experience. 6's face when she saw Picard told him something had happened. "Sharon," he said. "She's alive." "Barely." 6's voice was controlled with visible effort. "We extracted her before the drones could complete the tissue harvest. But the nanoprobes." She stopped. Started again. "The nanoprobes didn't complete assimilation. But they didn't fail completely either. She's in a state our medical systems have no protocol for. Part of her neural architecture has been rewritten. She's conscious, but her consensus signal, the connection she shares with the other Model 8s, is gone. She's been." 6 paused on the word with the precision of someone selecting a term that would be accurate even if it was terrible. "Individuated." The 2 said it quietly. "She's alone. For the first time in her existence, she's completely alone inside her own mind." The silence on the Enterprise bridge had a different texture from the silence aboard the base star. Riker had been running the tactical picture for 40 minutes, watching the cube with the focused attention of someone who knows that the thing they're watching is the most dangerous thing they have ever been in proximity to, and finding no comfort in experience. He had faced Borg before. Experience with the Borg was not reassuring. Experience with the Borg meant you had a detailed personal understanding of exactly how bad this could get. "The cube is withdrawing its assimilation tubes from the base star," Lieutenant Barnaby reported from Ops. "But it's not retreating. It's repositioning." "Repositioning how?" Riker asked. "Moving to a position equidistant between both base stars and the Enterprise." "Sir, I think it's—" Barnaby stopped, rechecked his reading. "I think it's broadcasting. Wideband transmission, using our own comm frequencies." Riker opened the channel. The voice that came through was not the standard Borg collective transmission. It was a single voice, synthesized, flat, assembled from components of other voices the way a Borg vessel was assembled from components of other ships. But underneath the synthesis, in the cadence and the word selection, Riker heard something he recognized with a chill that traveled the full length of his spine. It had Sharon's rhythm. The specific way she had paused between sentences during their brief encounter in the Basestars gathering room. The Borg had processed enough of her neural architecture to model her speech patterns and were using them now as a carrier frequency, a demonstration, as deliberate and cold as any weapon. "We have adapted. Your resistance has been instructive. We now understand what you are. We will not attempt further assimilation. We require only the Resurrection Hub's matrix and the FTL drive schematics. Surrender these." The biological units will be released. Non-compliance will result in the destruction of both vessels and the assimilation of all surviving biological material. Riker looked at the view screen. At the cube, dark and patient, and 3 kilometers of absolute certainty. Then he opened the channel to Picard. Picard heard Riker's briefing in the Basestars cargo bay, standing among Cylons and Centurions in the green-tinged half-dark of a ship that smelled of metal and something older. Something that might have been the accumulated presence of minds that had lived and died and lived again in these corridors for years. He listened without interrupting. When Riker finished, Picard was quiet for precisely the length of time it took him to be certain of what he was going to say. "Tell them we're considering that proposal." Riker's pause was brief but audible. "Yes, sir." The channel closed. Six was watching him. "You're buying time," she said. "I'm buying time," Picard confirmed. "I'd like to use it productively." He looked at data. "The deflector modification. Where are we?" 63% complete. The primary interference array is functional. I require the hub's secondary transmission nodes to be brought online to complete the targeting matrix. A process that the 4 has been managing remotely from the Enterprise, but which would be significantly accelerated by direct access to the hub's physical systems. The 4 was already moving toward a console on the cargo bay wall. 12 minutes with direct access. Possibly 10. And what does this modification accomplish? Six asked. It will prevent the Borg from extracting usable data from the hub's matrix even if they physically acquire the hardware. Data said. The interference field will corrupt any external attempt to read the stored consciousness data at the quantum level. The data remains intact internally, recoverable by systems calibrated to the original Cylon signal architecture, but will present to any external scanner, including Borg assimilation nanoprobes, as irretrievably damaged. You're making the hub useless to them without destroying it. Six said. That is correct. She looked at Picard. And the humanoid model template? You heard what your officer reported. They already have partial biological data from Sharon's assimilation. Partial is not complete, Picard said. Partial may be enough to tell them what they're looking at, but not enough to replicate it. The distinction matters. He paused. Though I won't pretend the window is large. It isn't. Six moved to the center of the cargo bay, and there was something in the movement, deliberate, carrying the weight of a decision made before the conversation began, that brought the room to attention. Even the Centurions seemed to register it, their optical sensors converging on her with something that might have been the mechanical equivalent of stillness. I have an offer, she said. For you, Captain. Not for the Federation. For you personally, because I have been reading your history in your shuttle's database for the past 8 hours and I have come to the conclusion that you are the specific kind of person who can hear this offer without either accepting it immediately or refusing it immediately. The kind of person who will hold it honestly and weigh it against everything it costs. Picard said nothing. He waited. We can give you the FTL drive technology. The cargo bay was quiet. Data's tricorder continued its soft cycling. The full schematics. Enough for your engineers to build a functioning jump drive within months. No transwarp conduit. No fixed infrastructure. Anywhere in the galaxy in an instant. She held his gaze. The Borg want it because it makes them unstoppable. We're offering it to you for the same reason. Because the only counter to an enemy that can appear anywhere without warning is the ability to do the same thing. And in exchange? Picard said. You use it to protect us. Not indefinitely. Not as a permanent alliance. Long enough for us to build a new resurrection hub with compatible subspace frequency parameters, establish a stable base of operations, and determine whether this universe is one in which we can survive without being someone else's asset or someone else's threat. She paused. We don't want to be absorbed by your Federation. We don't want to be subjects of your Prime Directive or your ethics committees or your very thoughtful diplomatic protocols. We want to exist. On our terms. in this universe that we did not choose and cannot leave. Picard looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Riker's face on the secondary comm screen, who had been listening to the entire exchange and whose expression was that of a first officer working very hard to reserve judgment, while simultaneously having several strong opinions. "You understand," Picard said carefully, "that the FTL technology in the hands of the Federation changes the balance of power in this quadrant in ways that I cannot predict and do not have the authority to accept unilaterally." "I understand perfectly," Six said. "I'm not asking for your authorization process, Captain. I'm asking for your decision." Right now, while the Borg are 40,000 kilometers away adapting to everything we've shown them and preparing something we haven't anticipated yet. Her voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but something in it reached a kind of absolute clarity. "The Borg will not give us the 10 minutes your lieutenant needs to finish the deflector modification. They will move when they are ready and not before. I am offering you a weapon and asking for time in return. Tell me if that's a trade you can make." From the hub chamber, carried through the audio feed that data had never closed, the hybrid spoke into the silence. "The soldier weighs the cost of winning against the cost of the method. Both costs are real. Neither cancels the other. He has stood in this place before, not this room, not this ship, but this specific moral geometry. He knows that the answer he gives will not feel clean. He gives it anyway because clean answers are for situations that do not matter." Picard looked at Six. "I can make that trade," he said. "But I want something else as well." "Name it." "Sharon. Whatever state she's in, whatever the nanoprobes have left her. She comes with us when this is over. She deserves access to Federation medical technology, and she deserves the choice about what comes next. That's non-negotiable." Something moved across Six's face that Picard had not seen there before. It was brief, and it was genuine, and it was grief and relief arriving simultaneously in the specific proportion that only happens when something you'd given up on turns out to still be possible. "Agreed," she said. "Then let's finish the deflector modification." Picard turned to Data. 10 minutes, Mr. Data. Get it done in 8. The Borg moved at the 7-minute mark. Not with the assimilation tubes. They had processed the failure of that approach and discarded it with the ruthless efficiency of a system that never repeated an unsuccessful strategy when an alternative was available. The cube fired a cutting beam directly at the hub Basestars engineering section, precise and measured, targeted not to destroy but to disable. To strip away the ship's defensive systems and leave the interior accessible without damaging the specific components the collective had designated for extraction. The Basestars shields held for 40 seconds. Then they failed. Deflector modification at 91%. Data reported from the Enterprise's ops console, his hands moving across the console with a speed that exceeded any human operator's physical capability. He had been back from the Baystar 90 seconds earlier, the 4's final technical specifications loaded and integrated, the targeting matrix aligned to the hub's transmission architecture with a precision that had required the simultaneous solution of 11 independent equations. "I need 70 seconds. "We don't have 70 seconds, Worf said. "I'm aware, Lieutenant Commander." The cube was deploying something new. The tactical display showed it emerging from a previously sealed section of the cube's ventral face, a structure that bore no resemblance to standard assimilation tubes or cutting beam arrays. It was smaller than either, more delicate in its visible engineering, and it was moving toward the hub Baystar with a deliberate, careful trajectory that suggested the collective was treating it with an entirely different category of care than its previous approach. "Analysis," Picard said. "The device appears to be a focused quantum state scanner of a type I have not previously encountered in Borg technology. It is designed to read the hub's consciousness storage matrix at the quantum level without requiring physical contact. If it reaches optimal range..." Data paused for 0.4 seconds, which was a long time for him. "It will extract a complete copy of the resurrection data regardless of the hub's physical state." My interference field must be active before the scanner reaches 30,000 kilometers from the hub. Current distance, 47,000 kilometers. At its present velocity, I have 61 seconds. 61 seconds, Riker said. Yes. You said you needed 70? Yes. On the secondary screen, the base stars were maneuvering. The uncompromised one placing itself between the cube's new device and its companion, raiders deploying from its launch bays in a defensive screen that the Cylons knew, and Picard knew, and everyone on the bridge knew would not hold the Borg for longer than seconds. The raiders were fast and numerous, and they were made of the same carbon-titanium composite that had confused the Borg nanoprobes, and none of that mattered. The Borg cube's point defense systems began eliminating them with the unhurried mechanical thoroughness of something performing a task too routine to require full attention. 6, Picard said. I need you to fire everything you have at the cube. Not the scanner device, the cube itself. Every missile, every weapon, everything. I need their point defense systems fully occupied. A brief pause. That will destroy most of our raiders. I know. A longer pause. Then, firing. The base stars opened up simultaneously, a wave of nuclear-tipped missiles that crossed the distance to the cube in 11 seconds and struck its shields in a sequence of detonations that lit the viewscreen white. The yield was enormous, larger than anything the Enterprise's own weapons could produce, and for a moment the cube's shields flickered under the sustained hammering, the green luminescence of its hull briefly dimming as power was rerouted to defensive systems. The scanner device slowed. Its trajectory wobbled as the point defense resources that had been tracking it were redirected. 61 seconds, Data said. 58. 55. They're adapting to the missiles, Worf reported. Shield modulation. The yield impact is dropping by 12% per volley. How many volleys does 6 have left? At current rate of fire, 3. Data. 41 seconds remaining. Modification at 96%. The second volley struck. The cube shields held more cleanly this time, the adaptation already partially functional. The scanner device resumed its approach. 34,000 kilometers, Barnaby called. Data, Picard said again, and there was nothing in his voice except the name. No urgency, no pressure, just a word, delivered as an acknowledgement that he understood exactly what was happening and was choosing to say nothing more because anything more would be noise. 98%, Data said. 99. Third volley. The Borg shields absorbed it almost completely. The scanner device crossed 32,000 kilometers. Complete, Data said. He engaged the deflector modification. The interference field expanded outward from the Enterprise in a sphere of subspace distortion that covered the hub base star in the same moment the Borg scanner reached optimal extraction range. The scanner fired. The quantum state red hit the hub's consciousness matrix, and found exactly what Data had designed for it to find. Not empty space, not corrupted data, but a perfect, complete-seeming, structurally coherent resurrection signal that dissolved into irretrievable noise the moment the scanner attempted to copy it. From outside, the hub's matrix looked intact. Every extraction attempt would produce the same result. The data was there and it was unreachable, like trying to catch light by closing your hand around it. On the tactical display, the Borg scanner device stopped moving. The cube went briefly silent. The particular silence that Picard had encountered once before, years ago, and never forgotten. The silence of 5,000 drones simultaneously processing an unexpected outcome. They're regrouping, Riker said quietly. Yes, Picard said. They still have Sharon's partial template data. Yes. And they know the FTL drive technology exists. Yes. Picard looked at the view screen. At the cube, dark and immense and recalibrating. They have not won what they came here for. But they have not lost either. They have partial data on humanoid model biology, and the confirmed existence of jump drive technology. He paused. which means the question is no longer whether the Borg become more dangerous from this encounter. They will. The question is how much more dangerous, and whether we've bought enough time to matter. The cube fired one final cutting beam, not at the base stars, not at the hub, but at the dimensional rupture coordinates where the Cylons had emerged. A precise, focused pulse that Picard didn't understand until Data turned from his console with an expression that was, for Data, the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "They've recorded the rupture's dimensional coordinates," Data said. "They are attempting to catalog the physics of the crossing point. They want to know how to open it themselves." The cutting beam pulsed once more. Then the cube turned and accelerated toward transwarp velocity. And it was gone. The bridge was silent. On the view screen, 2 damaged base stars drifted in the faint light of the Paulson Nebula, surrounded by the debris of several hundred raiders. From the hub chamber, the hybrid's voice came through the still open audio feed, quieter now, almost spent. 3 keys. They have found one. They are looking for the door. In the hours after the cube's departure, the Enterprise and the 2 base stars held position in the shadow of the Paulson Nebula and took stock of what remained. The accounting was not good, but it was not as bad as it had seemed at the closest moment. The hub's resurrection matrix was intact and protected. The FTL drive schematics were in the process of being transferred to the Enterprise's engineering database under the terms of the agreement Picard had made with Six. An agreement he would need to report to Starfleet Command in full, and which he was preparing himself to defend with the knowledge that it had been the right call and the full expectation that several admirals would disagree. The Cylons had lost more than half their raider complement, and sustained significant structural damage to the hub base star's engineering section. The Enterprise had a burnout secondary deflector coupling and 17 crew members who had been on the wrong deck when the cube's initial long-range burst had grazed their shields. Sharon was in sickbay. Dr. Crusher had been working with her for 4 hours by the time Picard came down from the bridge, and her expression when she met him in the corridor outside the ward carried the particular quality of a physician confronting something her training had not prepared her for. Not distress, exactly. Beverly Crusher had too much experience with the impossible for distress to be her first response. Something more precise, the careful attention of someone making a diagnostic map of territory that had no prior cartography. "She's stable," Beverly said. "Physically, the nanoprobe activity has been arrested. We used a modified version of the electromagnetic pulse treatment we developed after Wolf 359. It took 4 attempts to find a frequency that worked on her physiology without damaging her synthetic neural components, but it worked." She paused. "Medically, she'll recover." "And otherwise?" Picard asked. Beverly was quiet for a moment. "She keeps asking me if she can hear herself think. Not in a confused way. Literally. She says that her entire life her thoughts have had an echo, not voices exactly, but an awareness of others of her kind processing similar experiences simultaneously. A shared resonance. She looked at the closed ward door. She says now there's nothing. Just her. She says it's the loudest silence she's ever heard." Picard absorbed this. "Can it be restored? The consensus connection? I don't know. The Borg didn't destroy the relevant neural architecture. They overwrote certain synchronization pathways with Borg protocols, which we've now cleared. Whether the underlying silent signal can re-establish contact with the other Model 8s across whatever distance and dimensional variance separates them from their kind." Beverly spread her hands. "That's not a medical question, Jean-Luc. That's a physics question. Possibly a theological one." He visited Sharon briefly. She was sitting upright in the biobed, which Beverly had clearly not encouraged and equally clearly couldn't stop, her hands in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone managing something overwhelming through the application of conscious discipline. She looked at him when he entered with dark eyes that were entirely present and entirely alone. "I know what you did," she said. "Six told me. You negotiated for me." "I asked for the choice to be yours," Picard said. "That's somewhat different." She considered this. In my experience, most people who have power over other people's choices tell themselves the same thing. That's fair, Picard said. And accurate more often than I'd like. He sat in the chair beside the biobed, not standing over her, not performing authority. I'm not going to tell you what the right choice is. You can remain on the base star with your people. You can request Federation asylum and access our medical facilities until we understand more about your condition. You can ask me to leave this room and give you time to think. He paused. But I'll tell you what I believe, if you want it. She looked at him steadily. Tell me. I believe you survived something that was designed to erase you, and what you are on the other side of that survival is still worth knowing. I believe the silence you're hearing right now is terrible, and I believe it is not permanent, though I cannot promise that. He met her eyes. And I believe that a being who resisted the Borg long enough to introduce self-determination into their neural network, even for 0.3 seconds per cycle, is someone this universe has not finished being surprised by. Something shifted in her face. Not resolution. Resolution was too clean for what she was navigating. But something adjacent to it. The beginning of a direction. I'll stay, she said. For now. In the observation lounge, Picard wrote his report to Starfleet Command. He wrote it carefully and completely, without omission and without softening. He reported the Cylons' arrival, their technology, the Borg's response, the defensive measures taken, the agreement made. He reported that the Borg had departed with partial biological template data for humanoid model synthesis and confirmed knowledge of Cylon jump drive technology, and that the full implications of this acquisition were not yet calculable but were unlikely to be anything other than grave. He reported his recommendation that Starfleet begin immediate research into both counter-infiltration detection protocols and early warning systems capable of identifying subspace-independent FTL arrival signatures. He did not report what the hybrid had said. He kept that for his personal log, which he sealed with command-level encryption and a note to himself to return to it in 6 months and decide then whether it needed to be shared. 3 keys. They have found one. They are looking for the door. The Enterprise stayed at the Paulson Nebula for 2 more days, while engineering teams worked with Cylon technical staff on preliminary FTL drive integration studies, and Beverly Crusher established a medical exchange protocol with the Basestars organic crew that was as unprecedented as anything else about the week. On the second evening, Picard stood on the observation deck and looked at the nebula, that swirling, ionized, particular darkness, and thought about what it meant that this was the second time something terrible and transformative had arrived at this specific point in space. He didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns, in the way the universe organized events around the things it was trying to say. He wasn't certain what it was trying to say here. He suspected he would have time to work it out. Somewhere in the Alpha Quadrant, a Borg cube was processing partial data on a biological template it had never encountered before. In the precise, recursive architecture of the collective's consciousness, 11 drones continued generating microsecond independent decision cycles that the network had flagged as an anomaly, and not yet resolved. The collective had catalogued this as a low-priority processing irregularity, noise to be eliminated in the next maintenance cycle. It was not noise. It was the first time, in all the centuries of the Borg's existence, that a drone had experienced the faint, brief, 0.3-second flicker of wondering whether the collective was right. The Borg did not yet know what to call this. They had no word for it in their vocabulary, because their vocabulary had never required one. The word was doubt. The Borg sought perfection. They had always believed perfection meant completeness, every species absorbed, every technology integrated, every variable resolved into the single, unvarying signal of collective certainty. What they encountered at the Paulson Nebula in the year 2369 was something their philosophy had no framework for, a technology built not on certainty but on continuity, on the refusal to accept that death was the end of the self. Resurrection was not perfection. It was something stranger and more dangerous, the insistence that the individual persisted, that the self mattered enough to preserve across death, across distance, across the silence between stars. The Borg took fragments of this. They did not understand what they had taken. In the months that followed, Starfleet intelligence would report subtle shifts in collective behavior that no analyst could definitively attribute to the Paulson encounter. Minor tactical variations, unusual signal patterns from distant cube formations, a single intercepted Borg transmission that contained, embedded in its standard assimilation protocol subroutines, a sequence of code that bore a structural resemblance to a silent consensus loop and had no functional purpose the analysts could identify. The Cylons remained in the Alpha Quadrant. They were not Federation members, not Starfleet allies, not enemies. They were something the Federation had no existing category for, which Picard had come to believe was the most honest description of most things that mattered. Six and Picard met twice more in the following year, each time brief, each time carrying the texture of two people who had been through something together, and were still working out what that meant for what came next. Sharon served on the Enterprise for 4 months before requesting transfer to a Cylon vessel. The consensus connection never fully restored. She learned, in the way that people learn the things they cannot change, to live inside the silence. She reported, in her final conversation with Troy, that it was still the loudest thing she had ever heard, but that she was beginning to think the loudness might be the point. That individuality was not the absence of connection but a different kind of it, harder and quieter and entirely her own. The door the hybrid had spoken of was not open that year, nor the next. Whether it would be was a question Picard kept returning to in the years that followed, in the same way you return to something you've put down carefully in a specific place because you know you'll need it again. He kept the hybrid's words in a sealed log. He kept them because they were true, and because true things deserve to be kept. 3 keys. They have found one. They are looking for the door. The galaxy turned. The Enterprise moved on. Somewhere in the dark, the Borg processed their incomplete data and waited, with perfect mechanical patience, for the variables to resolve. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.